I'm probably not what you're expecting for a Moodley, right? Some of you are already looking at my fingers thinking, is she married? You're analyzing my hair. Is she mixed? What's going on with the grandparents? I'm used to introducing myself and spending 5 minutes watching the person on the other side of this conversation scrutinize what they think is subtly, without actually having to ask the question, what am I? My name is Cassandra Nontlantla Moodley, and I'm a product of democracy. You see, I was born in Durban in 1994, making me a born free, but I was abandoned at birth. And I was subsequently adopted by my wonderful parents, Sylvie and Danny Moodley. And now this could be a story about advocating for adoption, which would fit in well with the Standing Nation theme, but no, this is a story about democracy. This is a story about the power of democracy. This is a story about how democracy has the ability to change the trajectory of lives. So when I think about a standing nation, I think about the usual cliches. That term, unity and diversity, Rugby World Cup victories, that Nelson Mandela release image, all the warm and fuzzy the term rainbow nation manages to conjure up. However, when I think about the terms active citizenry and uprising, in my mind's eye, I see university campuses turned into war zones. I see burning tires and service delivery protests. Not warm, not fuzzy, and infinitely less appealing. And yet somehow in my observation, you can't separate standing from rising. And where there's a history of oppression, neglect, and inequality, then rising must become uprising. And so I propose to you tonight that if we want to get to the warm and fuzzy, if we want to get to a standing nation, then we need an uprising, a new age uprising. Now, South Africa is no stranger to historical complexities, painful atrocities, and inflicted inequalities. We all know this. However, our post-apartheid approach to democracy, healing, and unity is completely unsustainable. We've become a nation obsessed with putting plasters over bullet wounds. We love the big moments, the ones that help us forget. We love the hashtags affirming we're staying and that we're stronger together. We love the moments where the rainbow flag reminds us of the rainbow nation, and for but a moment, we're so much bigger than the problems that divide us. In fact, we're surprised when all of a sudden we want fees to fall, or when a death in a pit toilet in the Eastern Cape means a school burns, and then another death caught in the crossfire of gangsterism in the Cape Flats, and then we're plunged into darkness because of Eskom, and then we're plunged into darkness because we remember. We remember that for the average South African, life isn't memorable drives on Chapman's Peak. For the average South African, life is waking up too early, getting home too late, earning too little, and trying to make ends meet. For the average South African, life looks like taps that run dry and promises that crumble even as the walls are cracking in their RDP houses. For the average South African, life is a daily struggle to survive. And when all the frustration of living life in survival mode becomes too much, and people are moved through desperation to protest, we begin looking for the next fix. So what? No Rugby World Cup around the corner? Maybe Caster Semenya is about to break a new record. A nation obsessed with plasters for bullet wounds. So the question then becomes, what do we do? What actions do we take? How do we ensure we're moving forward holistically and not just superficially? Essentially, how do we ensure we're not breathing through the wound as a nation? I believe that the answer is to join in. I believe in a new age uprising that relies on the cornerstones of democracy to allow us to move forward and create the kind of country that we so desperately want and need. One of the things that we do as change agents is we run civic education workshops for young people. And these workshops allow us to grapple with different ideas of democracy. So we talk about what is democracy? What are the tools that we use in democracy to start changing the way our country is run? And one of the things I like to do is to start off with a base so that we're all on the same page. So a definition of democracy. And usually when I ask this question, I get a well-versed chorus of, a democracy is a government for the people, by the people. And I think in that definition, there lies a couple of misconceptions. And these misconceptions are where we've gone wrong in the last 25 years. We believe that when we say a democracy is a country for, a democracy is a government for the people, by the people, it means that once every 4 to 5 years, we get to elect our leadership, and our leadership will run our country. I disagree, and I pose a different definition. And that's if you're not working for your government, then your government simply isn't working for you. And now that's a gross oversimplification in a South African context. I give you that. But there's still some truth to that. Because a democratic government was created precisely to allow you and me, ordinary citizens, to have a degree of autonomy in not just the governance of this country, but taking our context into consideration, but also the way we shape this country. How do we create the future we need? And so it would seem that with all these tools that we've been given by another generation to shape our country, there's still something wrong. Year after year, we see a decline in service delivery, an increase in corruption, the collapse of state-owned entities, municipalities collapsing around the country. It would appear, if you were to believe the media, that the only recourse of action is the so often violent protest that we see. And so now I'm going to take a moment at this juncture to just speak very openly and honestly about protests. So collective deep breath in. Okay. Protest is our democratic right. Yeah, our Constitution guarantees this. But we'd be fooling ourselves if we think that it's sustainable. Protest, as it's come to be known in a South African context, costs us. It costs us in means of production. It costs us to repair, so monetarily, the damage that we create. In the case of Marikana, protests actually cost lives. And so why are we obsessed with this? With all the tools that democracy gives us, why are we still choosing to pursue a path that forges us further away from the future that we're trying to create? And I believe there are a couple of stakeholders that are shaping this narrative. And the first being the media. The media rewards protest. We see front page news, it makes front page news, we see full page spreads, and it gets prime time in our news TV slots. People know that if they protest hard enough, they will eventually be acknowledged. We never see the news talking about people who've approached government with petitions, people who have followed the democratic process, who have been in court, actually winning these fights. And so media plays a part in rewarding protest action. Us, as the privileged few, as ordinary citizens, we encourage protest. And some of you are probably looking at me and thinking, no, I'm definitely not one of those people, but we are. You see, we encourage protest by ignoring people until they brought protest to our doorstep. So we'll shake our heads at the recent protests in Soweto. But should a protest come to the center of our world, Sandton, the JSE, we're moved to action. We need to take note. When is this protest happening? Why is it happening? Why hasn't the government done anything? Who can we lobby to ensure that they fix these problems? We reward protest. But the biggest contributor to this narrative is government. Government, through their action and inaction, have made it known that serious protest means deliverables. When I run my workshops, I often differentiate between a government that is reactive versus a government that is proactive. And let me tell you, a proactive government doesn't wait until the UKZN HIV centre is burnt to a crisp before addressing a fees crisis. A proactive government doesn't wait until a young woman has been brutally raped and murdered on government property before acknowledging a gender-based violence epidemic. A proactive government doesn't sit until the citizens of this country have threatened to shake the very foundations this nation was found on, before doing simple things like, say, collecting waste on a regular basis. And here's an example where this ecosystem of media, ordinary citizens, and government works hand in hand to reward protests. So let's go with this example of regular waste collection. In December of last year, 2019, there was a protest in an informal community in KZN over the fact that waste wasn't being collected regularly. Now, media would not have reported anything about the state of this community prior to the protest. Check one. Us, as ordinary citizens, would never have been aware nor moved to action about the state of this community without the protest having happened. Check two. And government did not feel moved to respond until people decided to burn their waste in protest. Check three. You see, what happens is we fail to realize that one service delivery failure is part of a much bigger and broader systemic failure. So perhaps maybe, if you're living in Sandton, irregular waste collection is a nuisance, an inconvenience. But under those circumstances, where people are living under the poverty line and things are overcrowded, irregular waste collection means a breeding ground for disease. Where people are living under the poverty line, a breeding ground for disease means vulnerability to sickness. Where people are living under the poverty line, vulnerability to sickness means a reliance on our healthcare system, which is in crisis. So we see the headlines, residents burn waste in protest, and don't understand that this is part of a much bigger, much more violent and oppressive system. That's my piece on protests. But I want us to leave today with a couple of solutions on how we achieve a standing nation. What is it that we, as ordinary citizens, can do and should be doing? The first thing I want to suggest is that we use our voice. I think it's strange that in this post-apartheid era, the only time you hear about free speech in the mainstream media is after someone has said something inflammatory. The Constitution was written very deliberately, with painful life under apartheid rule in mind. So when we were granted the liberty of free speech, it's because we've come from a time where our media, our literature, our interactions with one another were heavily constricted. And this level of censorship is what allowed misinformation and inaction to thrive. Where am I going with this? Free speech and not communicating with one another? No. I remember sitting in a class, I must have been about 11 or 12, it was a history class, and for the first time, we were really diving deep into the nitty-gritty of apartheid, learning what the laws meant and how it impacted everyday life for different sectors of society. And we were appalled, naturally. And in this class, we vehemently swore, with all the naivety that youth allows, that had we been alive back then, we would have done something. We would never have been blind to the suffering and oppression of others. And I ask us today, what are we doing? We know that social media is a powerful tool. I don't know how many of you know this, but there are only 22 million active users registered for social media in South Africa, which means there's more than 50 million others who are not having a chance to represent themselves on this platform. And so as a younger generation, we need to start making space for others. We need to create a platform for others. And again, practically, what does this mean? I'm not suggesting we start Twitter wars in the name of being woke, but we do need to start fostering a culture that calls out injustice where we see it. And even more practically, let's say you're not inclined to politics, and that's fair, but you are passionate about something. So if you're sitting here tonight and you're a young male from Durban and your primary passion in life is surfing, well then that's your niche. Identify your niche and do the work around it. And so doing the work would look a lot like figuring out who you share this resource with. Who are the coastal communities that depend on the ocean for their livelihood? Who are the people affected by climate change Who are the people affected by climate change? Who are the people affected by overfishing illegally? How do you use your love for the ocean and your shared mutual interest with these people who rely on it to elevate their situation? How do you use your relative privilege to legitimize their concerns? That's the work we need to be doing. And I'm not saying it's a silver bullet that fixes everything, but it's a start. Because if we can start creating these pockets of community that rally around causes that are important and significant to them, we can start to change the fabric of our society. Now, the second point that I have for us today is that we need to vote smart. We know that politics affects every area of our lives, from where we live, how much rent we pay, what we eat, if we eat. And so that makes choosing the people who decide how our lives play out for a period of time the most important single action that you can do. We need to move away from the sensationalism and the learned opinions from our friends and family and society when it comes to voting. And so when I run my workshops, this is one of the toolkits that I impart on our learners. And it's something I like to call the voting scorecard. So what that looks like is, firstly, we identify as a group 5 burning issues. These could be climate change, gender equality, youth unemployment, education, and healthcare. I then ask the students to take a moment and figure out which of these issues is most important to them. By doing this, we start to move away from emotional voting to issue-based voters. Our voting is now based on intelligence. Our voting is now based on a personal burning issue. And this is something I encourage all of us to start thinking about. What are the issues that impact your life, your work, your family, your future? Center your voting around that, not what you just read in the newspapers or what you think you know, but what you actually know. The second part of this process looks like identifying the different elements of democracy that we appreciate. So this varies from school to school, but I'd say the top three that I always come out with are transparency, accountability, and accessibility. Why this step is important is because I then ask learners to take those three top issues or top elements of democracy and score their politicians against this. Is candidate A transparent? Transparency is important because we need to know what politicians are doing, but we understand things happen. So is candidate A accountable should something go wrong? And most importantly, is candidate A accessible? It's all great and it's all good and well coming to me during election periods, but can I get a hold of you when things aren't going as well, when you aren't keeping up with your promises? I ask people to do it in this step because it then allows you to thirdly examine policies. People are able to talk a good game and punt the right policies, but if they're not transparent, accountable, and accessible, and they're not working on the issues that you believe in, you're on a slippery slope. The last thing that I'd like to suggest is that we partner up. Partnering up doesn't mean that you have to support or have voted for the party in power, nor does it mean that you can't be a supporter of the party in power. But what it does mean is that your primary loyalty lies to South Africa. In his infinite character wisdom, Lord Varys in Game of Thrones once said, "You want to know where my true loyalties lie. Not with any king or queen, but with the people. The people who suffer under despots and who prosper under just rule. We need the kind of patriotism and self-appointed diplomacy that says, I'm going to work with whoever is in office to ensure that this next term is a success, and the one after that, and the one after that. We do this practically by using something I call the commend and condemn system. So when a politician says something that maybe sounds a bit wishy-washy but has some truth to it, you commend them and you run with it. And you ensure that whatever you're doing in your personal capacity is to support that. Equally, when a politician isn't doing well, you condemn them. And you let them know that because of this action, they have just lost your vote in the next election. And we need to be steadfast in that. The ideas that I'm proposing tonight, none of which are silver bullets, as I've mentioned before, allow us to harness the collective power of democracy. And when we do that, when democracy works, when it really works, it gives people a name. It gives people like me a home. And most importantly, it changes the trajectory of lives. And I thank you.